So shall we sing the Ukrainian national anthem?
Well, what a tragic situation that is.
Yeah.
Boy,
Boy, I'll tell you, the guy that comes out looking good here is Zelensky, you know.
yeah, I don't need a ride. I need ammunition.
Yes.
Boy, but how tragic.
Yeah. Hi, Sally.
Hi, Sally.
Did you heal lots of people today?
I was very busy. Yes.
Yeah.
COVID is slowing down though. That is
Hey.
definitely a wonderful thing. Although we're still double mask with goggles, 8 hours in a row, but the numbers are dropping. We're not having as many people with symptoms and testing, and so it's good. It's all good.
Yeah, the numbers are certainly very encouraging that we're
Yeah.
seeing, which is great.
Yeah, very good.
We might even be able to have a parade this year, right?
That's the
Wow.
plan.
Very cool.
Now you get to march in a parade, Sally.
Really?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Oh,
Yeah. It's kind of fun.
great. I love that.
It's the only parade I've ever marched in. I always, I walked next to Ed Koretko because everyone knows Ed, so I could hide behind him.
Is it the Memorial Day or Labor Day?
Memorial Day.
Okay, nice.
And it's a good walk, you know. To go down Main Street, hang a Yui at the Kennybunk Pizza and come back.
Oh, yeah, that's good. It'll be fun.
Geez, Blake, you could have had some fun with that and talked about how you went out to the turnpike and then down to Wells and
Yeah.
back around. You could have had fun.
I would
with
have
it.
completely fallen for it too. Yeah.
There's Lisa, Karen, Chris. Joel is hiding, but he's there. I can feel his presence.
Yes.
Shiloh's there. Hey, Shiloh.
Joel says the same thing about feeling my presence, but I usually have a bill in my hand and it's not always very friendly. So I always wonder what people mean when they say that. I think it's positive, right? Right, Joel? Wait a minute. See, this is our team. Yes, yes.
What you got?
There's no Q in team.
I'm turning my mic off.
That's a good idea. All right. We have 3 attendees. We have Betsy, John, and Ted so far. What time is it? Oh, it's time to start. Let's see how many. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. Well, let's get going. So I will call to order the Tuesday, March 1st, 2022. As my sister always likes to say, rabbit, 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 because it's March 1st. Workshop on climate action and other assorted items. And I think we're going to turn this over to Chris and Karen. Any introduction from you, Mike, or?
None whatsoever. I think they've
Okay.
done all the lifting and can run with it.
Okay.
Chris?
First
Karen?
off, good evening. Thank you. And actually, I'm glad you said Karen, because if anybody realizes why anything works, it's usually because she's had a lot to do with it. So if I'm remiss in saying that, then I'm in trouble.
I wouldn't make that mistake. Yeah.
I know. Well, thanks for giving me the chance to say that. Something I think that's important about this workshop, and I'll bring up a PowerPoint in a minute to kind of walk us through it, is it's a bit of an unusual way to go about it. Is I think we talked about this at the budget process, is the town had allocated or identified $59,000 to participate in a 4-community cohort, develop that regional climate action plan. And, each community is going to get the technical assistance of the folks at SMPDC, and that's going to involve a lot of public engagement and outreach, as well as involvement of people who are very adept in this arena. I think we recognize this was important to do at this stage, kind of a local level, before you just cast a wide net and say, hey, what do we have to do? And you jump to some preconceived notion. So what's odd about it is we had embarked down this path at SMPDC, as I think we've very successfully done with other things, and they had developed a scope of work to sort of bring us through that entire process. Ironically, what happens is there is a program through the governor's Office of Policy and Innovation for the Future that's called the Community Resilience Partnership that does the exact same thing, except It provides strategies, pathways, access to funding, and all those kind of things. In order to get that, you have to hold this community workshop. So it's almost like a back and forth. We're saying what's important to the community, but we're going to go talk about it in the future. So it's sort of like an unusual way to do things. But I think what is really helpful for me, and I'll start by sharing my screen and help, maybe this will make some sense, is what the project's going to be. And I just kind of talked about it very briefly, is our goal is to join the Community Resilience Partnership Program. And like I just said a moment ago, when we do that, it identifies all of these other programs that are out there. There's all kinds of different strategies we're going to go through, both short-term, medium-term, long-term, how we do it for planning, building resilience, all of these type of things that's going to affect our everyday decisions. And in order for us, we can just go it alone, which I think we kind of anticipated doing. When we go it alone, we always find other resources and say, oh, by the way, there's these programs. In order for us to take advantage of these programs, we have to show that we're going to sort of be eligible for their funding. Not too different than the comprehensive plan did 20 years ago when it first came out and was a pathway to, smart growth. So this is sort of like smart growth for the environment and the climate. One thing that they talk about wanting the communities to do is what's called a community resilience self-evaluation. That's a little bit difficult to do. When you don't really have a program, it's hard to evaluate it. So it's sort of, it feels a bit unusual to kind of go through this procedural process, but I think we can do that with some questions we're going to talk about, and by showing the scope of work. And what we'll be able to do is basically sign up for this program, make us eligible for a planning grant, and whether we get the grant or not, it's going to be in alignment with what both the governor's office is looking for and any other entity that has access to resources, because that's just not the only person out there. There's government programs out there. I participated in a phone call this morning with Maggie Barton-Hagen with ICLEI, and they actually talked about some significant funding sources they have for communities that, they're not a government agency, they're an entity who provides resources. So sort of when you kind of follow a good playbook, it opens up all kinds of other doors. Something I'll take a second to show you is, this is sort of the wow part of the slide. And it's just that. If you can focus on this slide, well, guess what? I missed my point because it's all over the place. And that's kind of what climate planning is. Planning for the future involves so many different parts to it. It can send you in all these different directions. And without a plan and a process and that public input, community buy-in, we can be going off in all these different directions. So I think that was really my purpose of putting the slide together this way, showing that. I will show you what the scope of work has been identified through the cohort independent of this. But ironically, what it does is it kind of takes its turn working its way all the way around this with so many things we do. And I think that's really important, but it helps us do it a little bit more strategically, because if we have all these goals, but we can't tell the difference between a short-term, a long-term, medium-term, everything's a short-term goal, then it's very hard to get things done. But what's nice is when you see all of these come right from the Governor's Office of Policy and Innovation for the Future. So this is what they're saying. This is what you focus on when you have resources for funding. And it's actually pretty smart because there's a breakdown that actually shows examples for all of these things. Modernizing Maine's buildings. Ironically, with the new energy code, you're already doing new development that way. How do you take that and apply it to old things? We've talked to, and again, in our budget this year, Joel may recall, we put money in there to do kind of an energy audit of this building. So we're already doing these things, but it's now how do we effectively do that and actually take credit for it? Because like if every grant, sometimes there's always a match. Well, geez, if we're doing something one here that qualifies as a match for something else and gives us more funds, that's only good planning anyway. So these aren't goals I just thought up by myself. These are goals I looked at their list of things and said, here's everything you try to do. And we can explain and talk about what any of them mean, but realistically, when we go through this process, there's going to be a lot of community involvement and discussion and walking us through that and participation at all kinds of levels. So this is very good. Some things that I think we want to talk about tonight, and I think whether it's the board or the public or anybody, here are things that we want to get a sense for. And this comes right from the community self-evaluation, community resilience self-evaluation. These aren't my questions, these are theirs. But what they're trying to get every community to do is be honest with where they think they're at. You know, what are two things we think we're doing well? I made some notes so I can tell you what we're doing well, just in case somebody doesn't answer, because, you know, it's sort of unfair. I'm giving you a test without you knowing the subject. And that's that's actually really difficult because I think we talked about it earlier in the month. We asked about, how's the seawall doing? Well, that's certainly something that's responding to climate change, but how are we doing in other areas? Well, you think about fuel efficiency and all these things, so it's all interrelated, but these things make a big difference when we go through that. Everybody has a slightly different interpretation of what short-term means. I think from a planning perspective, we sometimes think in that 0 to 3 range. I think also, if you go back and you think about the facility study, when we first did it, and we talked about the existing buildings, we talked about 0 to 12 months. So short term is like, okay, what's my problem of the day? So that does mean different things for them. I think what you're looking at is through a budgetary planning, implementation, execution process. What's a short-term item? That's kind of that 0 to 3 year range. And I think something to talk about that will be very important is when we go through this process with 3 other communities, all of them in some way are very similar to us, whether it's Biddeford, Kennebunkport, or Kittery. There's a seasonality to that. There's people's ability to participate and get that true community input, and it doesn't always happen in a very linear fashion. It sometimes has these starts and stops. So short-term sort of can stretch, not in a 12-month process. It can get to 24 months very simply because of it, span multiple budget cycles. What's important for our community to address in the long term, I think everybody might have a slightly different answer, but I think the purpose will be the same. Climate change. How are we going to address that? What are the impacts? But I bet everybody could offer a different perspective. The last question I think is a little bit tricky because you're specifically saying what 3 to 5 actions are priorities. And probably what it would do is I would say this. When I go to the scope of work that the cohort's going to accomplish, more importantly, I'd like people to kind of read that and say, oh, okay, these priorities are things they're identifying. Do we feel comfortable with that? Because to try to say we should focus on greenhouse gas emissions versus building resilience, it means different things, but they're all important. So I think what you have is you sort of have a wheel of fortune, but I'll call it like a wheel of climate actions you're going to spin and grab from. They're all going to be in this mix, and that's kind of important. This is what the cohort identified for scope of work. All 4 communities are going to participate and get this same level of expertise. And I think the very first one is critical. Public engagement, something that SMPDC is going to lead through their staff isn't the public engagement piece. They're going to put out an RFP. They're going to do everything what they do with an RFP, not only generate that, but score it, interview people, and try to find that best fit engagement consultant who can actually talk to the community in so many different fashions and hear those things and advise to make sure you're not trying to be the expert. They're sort of a facilitator that helps their other people be more effective in what they do. And then you can see these other items, the baseline assessment, that's a very technical piece. Review of existing plans, policies. We have some. We just went through a whole climate change chapter on the comp plan that identified goals, policies, and strategies. We have an anti-idling ordinance. The Energy Efficiency Advisory Committee had gone through. We signed on to the Mayor's Global Covenants. We have all this stuff we've done, but now it's sort of like, how do we bring it together? There are some of these greenhouse gas inventories. This stuff has been done. It becomes more applicable to all of our buildings. And I think what could be good about this is we're talking about this for our community. So when we start to talk about it to the community, we try to be as broad-based as we can. And one big member of our community is the RSU. We shouldn't forget their ability to participate in this. They're large buildings, what they contribute. We say the town, but who is all of the town? If there's other public and private members who pay attention to that as well, that don't feel regulated but participatory, those are good things we can do as well. The climate change vulnerability assessment, it kind of says what it is. I just say, think about the coastline. Okay, sea level rise is something people are getting their arms around very quickly, just by the nature of things that happen or have happened. And that's vulnerable, very vulnerable. What continues inward? Well, there's other things that go into that. I think it's raising that awareness, and I could go on and on about it forever, but it's not just that. It's every action and decision we make is extending into the future. So that's a vulnerability in itself. I think 5 is a real action-oriented item, the greenhouse gas reduction goal strategy development. That's something when we take it away, it's going to be a menu of all these things we can try to do. Again, this isn't supposed to be answered tonight. It's more like, here's what we're going to be focused on through this 18-month process. I've probably made the mistake of focusing too much on item 7 and rolled it all under the name of a climate action plan. In a way, these 6 items lead up to the climate action plan. And that's sort of, everybody kind of wants an acronym or something simple to refer to. In essence, I think of it like our strategic plan for climate change and how we deal with it. That's what our climate action plan will be. Step 8 and 9, the adoption, the implementation. In some ways, the adoption is more or less, how do we make it part of our operational policies? How do we make it part of our budget? How do we make it our day-to-day ongoing things? And looking at everybody else does it. One good thing about dealing with 3 other communities, they all can kind of say how they work through these things, what does work, what doesn't work, and it's a resource. And then the public engagement, if we don't do number 9, it doesn't matter what you do for the first 8. If we do all the stuff, then what do we do? It has to be part of that everyday type of conversation. So the cohort, what was really nice about it is the people who are knowledgeable, who have the expertise, who have kind of gone through this, they sort of said, here's what works. Do you feel this is your fit? And we kind of had a couple of different meetings. We talked about these things and we talked about timing, budget-wise. It's for all of this amount of work to be accomplished for the fee we're looking at, it's actually a phenomenal deal. That's part of an economy of scale, what you're getting with a consultant who's doing the same type of work and spreading it out. So that's a very good thing. Part of it also is for the last, I think, 3 years now, the town has been participating as one of the 6 town communities as funding the sustainability coordinator position with SMPDC. So we've been kind of on the job training. And what I mean by that is the person has all the technical expertise, but they've got to learn the region and the community. So they're not coming in blind. They have already established some of these relationships. I know them, they know us. They work with other staff, so there's not this big ramp up. So there's a real value in SMPDC continuing to do that stuff. I mean, they're in the news a lot. They're very adept at this. I know the state looks at them for a lot of things. So this is sort of what's built in. I think when we talk about what we want to talk about tonight, some of it is saying, of these 9 items, did this make sense? Is there something we're missing? Because if there is, that's things that when we go through, when we apply for the Community Resilience Partnership Program, we want to focus on, hey, this might be further down the right line. What do we need to do? And of course, I'll kind of tie it back together as what are the next steps? When it's all said and done with whatever anybody wants to say tonight, where are we trying to get to? Something we have to do to try to apply for this grant and certainly to enroll in the Community Resilience Partnership. Prior to doing that, the select board has to adopt a sample resolution. What the sample resolution will say is that we held a community workshop and here are some things we want to be focusing on as we pursue climate change planning. That's what I'm going to call it from a real simple standpoint. And most of those items, unless there are some things that don't make sense in that cohort, we'll probably tag several of those, right? The greenhouse gas emissions plan, inventory, that type of stuff. And then when we bring this back next Tuesday, if there's any other things that don't make sense or should be in there, that's what we want to try to do. It's a lot of work to get to the state to say, hey, I'd like some type of subsidy to help us with this planning. If we don't get it, if somehow the grant doesn't come to fruition, which I can't really imagine for the small amount, it wouldn't. We already have put forward the funding and we have a pretty good plan to do that. But I think what this is this showing us what it takes to start these conversations and how they have to go on for a long period of time. My job becomes relatively simple after this. I fill out a form, I send this to the state, and we're members of the program. What becomes after that is whether we get awarded the grant or not. You may recall this money went through the budget process. That doesn't become eligible until even if the budget passes July 1. So there's all of that lead up and walk through, but this is just a step in the way. After this, when this work begins, there will be extensive opportunities to engage the public all throughout this process, every bit along the way, both at the staff level, community level, all this kind of stuff. And I think that is, we learned some things through the comprehensive planning process. And one thing we learned is you can never do enough, and trying to get people's attention and keep them there is super important, because at the end, we're asking them to live with this. So that's kind of my real brief piece in terms of what these things are. I think I would like to kind of leave this slide up a little bit. And if I turn my mic off, either let people pause for a minute, think if there's any thoughts of what do these questions mean to you? What are there some answers you may come up with? When I fill out the community resilience checklist, part of it's going to be is how were we able to answer these questions? They don't have to be great answers. It has to be like, oh my gosh, I hadn't even thought of that. Well, that actually might be a fine question, but that's sort of what my objective is to be tonight, is to kind of put this together and be able to say to the state, here's areas we're going to focus on. That's pretty easy because we have the cohort stuff. Here's what the community's input was as we went through this process, and here's how we continue to do that as part of our future. So if there's any specific questions about what I'm asking, I'd be happy to answer that. Otherwise, I'd be happy to be quiet.
Let's see, Bill, do you have a specific question or a comment?
Well, it's a little bit of both, but they're brief. Okay, yeah, the specific question, I guess, is, well, one of the things I just wanted to make a mention. In some of the legislation that we're seeing at the LPC, the state seems to be using a uniform measurement of 4 feet for sea level rise between now and 2021. Or no, not 2021, but now into the 2100. So that may be just something as if you need a dartboard to shoot at in your planning. But the other thing too is that we look at what is the important to address for the long term. Would is economy part of it, Chris?
Yes, very much so.
Yeah,
I mean,
say
it's
that
our
because
vulnerability
we will
assessment.
have to transition from the coast from the tourism thing when we lose the beaches.
You're correct. I think when you go back to the comp plan, it identifies the need to focus on this issue. When you look at that vulnerability assessment, in a funny way, what the town's been doing well, I think, in my opinion, is taking every opportunity to pay attention to this. When we participated in the Tide Taxes and New Tactics program, I wouldn't say we were ahead of our time. We're willing to say, yeah, we think this is important. And we had people come in and that's exactly what they did. The difference is, and I think you made a critical point, is at that time, and this turns back the clock 3 years when we first started that process, we were trying to take these different levels, sea level rise projections, and say, which ones do we plan for? And I think when you talk about what's going on now, the states recently completed their, what they call Maine won't wait. And they have kind of taken a position of how they see what are appropriate planning targets and what you work through. And that actually helps people because I was trying to sit in a room full of people and say what I thought people could grasp. And I said, well, you know what, if you look at the height of a doorknob off the ground, that's approximately 3 feet. They can grasp that when they think about what it means for sea level rise. But if you try to talk about what's 18 inches, what do they know? And I'm talking about an outlet and all these, but how does it translate to the public who makes these decisions? Because in 4 years, you folks may all have something better to do, may not involve tonight or that type of thing, but somebody else is going to have the same issue. So what I think you said was important, though, the state has caught up and said, here's how we're going to move forward with it. And all of that stuff's on the table. And I think what they want to do is they don't want to limit people's access to funding. They want to encourage it. And they've actually done a pretty good job by showing people, here's those focus areas. And they've kept the threshold kind of low initially. I think it's going to be higher. All of the state programming, DOT, they're looking at the same too. So yeah, that is real important.
And that dovetails on my last point here. And that is, as we look down in Middle Beach, and I'm not sure, in my opinion, Middle Beach is first, but I could be dead wrong. As we look at that, at some point, we're going to have to look at what houses we buy. Because we're going to have to buy people out down there, I imagine.
I think this is maybe the smartest thing I can do is just do what you're identifying. That area is at risk. Something, if climate continues in some way, shape, or form in the future, what we have seen is the splashover has changed over the years. Whether the town has to buy, that's a policy type of thing. If they don't, they could be repetitive damages, all those type of things. The federal government could redesignate areas as a coastal barrier resource area. And when you do that through FEMA's mapping, that actually doesn't give you the ability to rebuild. So that doesn't necessarily mean the town has to buy somebody out. There could be other legislation that changes, or they may say, we're not satisfied to continue to have the town invest in infrastructure that may not survive its full life. Sometimes there may be some policies that are made for us. I'm not saying we want to or don't. So I think that it's intuitive to say, hey, there's an issue there. That's probably the best way to do that invites more conversation. If I arrive at a conclusion, it's very hard to have a conversation. So does that make sense?
Okay, so I guess the game plan here, Chris and Karen, is 10 minutes from us and then 30 minutes from the public. And I Let's see whether the board has any thoughts yet, or whether they need a little more time to do some head scratching here. There's Sally and there's Lisa. All right, Sally, you're up first.
Okay, so just a curiosity, Chris, does what we're doing with the Kennebunk River, the Restoration Committee, one of the things that they've got going and dealing with is the warming up of the river and the idea of planting some low brush and shrubs. Does that fall under this at all?
You know what, this is why even prepare for these meetings? When you ask those questions, it's perfect, because you're absolutely right. So yes, it does. When you think about what climate change is, it's temperature, it's all of these types of things. The warming the rivers sees reduced oxygen levels, that has impacts on these things. So yes, I mean, that's exactly what happens. It's intuitive. We look at sea level rise and say that's it, but it's all of these other things we do. So our practices that we put in place, our policies, that all makes a difference. Obviously, greenhouse gas emissions are something that is a direct piece that causes that, but the outcome or the consequences just like that. The river is affected in ways we may not necessarily understand. Similarly, when you think about the types of storms, the frequency, the flooding that happens, it's going to influence the type of development in those areas and all that kind of stuff. So you can get stream bank erosion, all those types of things. So yes, as we recognize how things are going to change, how things are going to perform, that's all part of that assessment. So I would say there isn't probably any particular topic somebody can point to that somehow isn't affected by the climate.
Thank you.
You're welcome.
Sally, Lisa, and then Courtney.
Hi, Chris. Thanks so much for doing this. Don't mind my voice. I lost it this weekend and it's just starting to come back. But
You remember I had a black eye a week ago. So
oh, that's right.
We can call it even. Yeah.
Okay, sounds good.
You're wearing makeup though, Chris.
It did go away, I promise.
So I just so my question is, so these 4 questions that you're asking us, you're going to take those and fill a form out and submit it. That's essentially what you're doing. Okay.
Yeah.
So I was just going to run down my quick thoughts on the questions if everyone's ready for that. So as far as things that our community is doing well, I think that just having this conversation, that's the obvious answer. I like that the town is starting to talk about composting. I like that Chief Rowe, got his Tesla and was thinking outside the box. And that we're members of ICLEI, we're committed to maintaining, to paying those dues. We're part of SMPDC. And so those were my thoughts on just what we're doing well. Short-term goals, I'll tell you, my kids, their big thing is getting rid of plastic straws. So I feel like a lot of communities have eliminated those, and that's an easy fix. And that's kind of what they focus on, and they make me carry around metal straws, which I think is a good first step, especially being on the coast. The other short-term goal I think that we could do is promoting electric vehicles for town staff and just people coming into our community and having charging stations at town hall and at other town buildings and around. I think that that's an easy thing to do. Long-term goals, I think we need to, as far as sea level rise, look at our zoning and our ordinances. I know Wells has changed some things where buildings have to be raised when they're built. So things like that. And then you had mentioned it, but this was one of my things, is that involving the RSU, looking at electric buses and promoting maybe solar in the schools and things like that, I think is a great long-term goal. And then 3 to 5 actions, my quick 3 were the fact for composting and reducing solid waste. I came from a community that was essentially all composting and recycling. We had very little solid waste. And so I look forward to Kennebunk being involved in that. And just promoting energy efficiency in general. Obviously I'm on the EEAC, but promoting, letting people know about Efficiency Maine, the rebate programs that they offer, just promoting that they can have a specialist come into their home, my house has old windows, just different things that people can do. I think that therefore they use less energy. And then the other one that is kind of, I think Courtney and I talked about this, but reducing the sale of gas fueled yard equipment. I know Washington, DC has taken that on, as well as California, the whole state. And it doesn't mean you can't use them, but it's just as a community, we're saying we don't want to sell them and we want to promote electric equipment and things. So that's just my thoughts off the top of my head.
Very good, Lisa. Thank you. Courtney?
Yeah, thank you, Chris, and everyone. These are questions that I think I'll, dwell over a little bit and then like give you some specifics, but I think like listening to what you're saying and then just having some thoughts like relating it to the current committees that are existing. When I think about it from like an economic standpoint, I think about how these things are not cheap. Obviously, we're having to talk about a grant to make sure that we're protected. And I think that moving to electric, gas costs money, but it's not as though electric is necessarily saving us like boatloads and boatloads of money immediately. A lot of this stuff, takes time. And I completely agree with all the points. I think any little thing that we can do is going to help the bigger picture. But I guess when I look at it, I think of how, like, what plans are there in place from like a state perspective of grants that businesses could be, incoming businesses that want to join here, move here, including like hotels and things like that, larger businesses. What could they be doing and what kind of strategy could we as a board kind of come up with that would create, whether it's ordinances for them or some type of reciprocal, you rub my back, I'll rub yours type of thing. Like, yes, we can help you out in this aspect of your business, but you have to help us put in 2 electric charging stations. So instead of us always taking on the expense of these things, how can we diversify that burden with some of the assets we have in town? And, what does that look like? So maybe like a you and Joel conversation of how some of these things would overlap. I think a solar field is something that would be really beneficial to see at some point for the town. Obviously, with the rising prices of electric and not knowing how that's going to go, we're all very lucky right now that are on KLPD. But what if that changes for the town? That, it's not just the residents, but the town itself. So mostly for me, I think about like, how can we profit off of the things that are also going to make us better? People are already spending money. So how can we move businesses, residents, incoming developers, incoming businesses? How can we gear them towards making these sustainable decisions? And how can we entice them to do that? So whether it's like some type of tax break, but at the same time, they're, costing us less money in another area, like usage or whatever. And I think you kind of have to dive deeper into that. But that's where my mind goes right away, is like putting our foot down and sort of looking at what we have and the footprint that we do have, looking at what other small communities are doing that is effective. You obviously always see solar and you see electric charging as kind of like the number 1 and 2. And then like your waste supply and wanting to make sure your capacity is high enough for, everyone thinks about the beach because we think about sea level rise, but if you don't plan for the other parts of town as well, when the beach is gone, the next problem is going to really be where we've developed. So I think if we can put our foot down soon, a shorter term goal for me would be what most people might look as a long-term goal. For me now, it's let's start an ordinance now that people who come in have to have some type of solar or cost saving LEED certified, components to their buildings or business, some type of tax reductions on businesses who are willing to do whatever, or electric vehicles for residents. It's not just going to be marketing and advertising and crossing our fingers that's going to make it happen. I think we have to have real skin in the game to make people move forward with this. So that's the perspective I look at it from. I think we're on a really great track and a good start. And thank you.
Okay, Shiloh, you're up.
Thanks. This is great, Chris. Appreciate the presentation and the comments that everyone has gone before. I agree with almost all of it. I think this would be well served to have a little bit of time to think about it and come back with answers as opposed to just doing kind of off the cuff. But I can address a few things. I think it's important. You brought it up. I think it was points 5 and 6 in your bullet points, where the different distinguishing between 5 and 6 greenhouse gas reductions goals and strategies, and climate change adaptation goals and strategies, because those are both things related to the climate, but they're very often, and sometimes they're an action or idea can have be related to both, but often those are not the same thing, right? So we as a town are making a commitment, for example, or have made prior commitments to energy efficient vehicles, electric vehicles. We're changing over the street lamp lights to LEDs. Those are greenhouse gas reduction goals. We're trying to become more energy efficient and use less energy in our buildings. That's greenhouse gas reductions. And that's great. And I think we should be doing as much of that as we possibly can. The climate change vulnerability, climate change adaptation is more about things like how do we handle the coast? How do we handle increased rainfall, increased stormwater runoff, all of those things that Sally alluded to it. Those are, like you said, there's a lot more. People talk about sea level rise, but in fact, that's going to be one of the later things that hits us in many ways. It's going to be slowly ongoing, and it is a huge problem, but there are immediate effects that are happening throughout our community, throughout our state. So when we're talking about what we can do and what we're doing well, I think it's really important to be keeping those two things distinct and thinking about does this action, because it's related to climate, what is it actually doing? Is it a thing that reduces greenhouse gas emissions, or is it a thing that helps our community adapt to the changing climate? So if we go back to looking at what it is we're doing well, you're absolutely right. I don't know who said it. I think Lisa said it, that thinking about this and planning, we're doing a good job, I think, at least initially, of having these discussions, of planning, of incorporating climate, understanding of what climate impacts will be and how we can mitigate climate change to the extent possible within our community. We've been thinking about that for some time. We're advancing that. So planning around climate change is one of the things that we're doing well, and certainly one of the things that we should continue and expand on. And then, can we jump back to the other slide and the questions?
There we go.
Yeah. I wanted to jump to, and I guess one of the questions I had about thinking this through is we're talking about it says community, so it's not necessarily the town as in like the town administration, right? So this is our whole community, and we're throwing out ideas for the whole community versus things like we should improve the town buildings or building municipal buildings or the municipal fleet or policy related to how we address, use energy. That's certainly stuff we should be doing. That's within our purview. But in this exercise, you're talking about, Courtney, I think you mentioned solar field. Like, that's not necessarily something that the town of Kennebunk is going to do, though we could certainly, enter into a partnership with anything like Light and Power or Central Maine Power or another entity and try to promote that. But we're not in the electric business. So I guess I'm questioning in this exercise, are we talking about all the possibilities that could occur within the boundaries of the town of Kennebunk, or is it just things that the town controls?
Yeah, one, I think you seem to do this very well. You key in on a word I always try to emphasize, and that's community, because you're right. If it's just the town doing it, well, we can only go so far. And I think something that this exercise tonight falls short of is we're almost trying to feel like we have to accomplish something, and you really can't, because it's a much more thoughtful, longer conversation. I think what the town can do is recognize our role as it relates to other people. And in some ways, a good example, and I don't want to say this, I want to say it like it's something we should arrive at. Many communities have repurposed their landfills as a solar farm, call it that. some have been successful, some have run into real challenges. So I want to be real careful about saying, hey, we can do that. But when we look at an area like that, okay, there is a private initiative that can do something that can actually help accomplish other goals. And I think that's sort of looking at some of those partnerships as well and what that means. And so we can think about how we as the town leaders can also incentivize and help others, just sort of like Courtney was saying, from business perspective. We can also look at it in a deeper level too. We have energy efficiency bonuses in our ordinance for residential dwellings. So we can enhance some of those types of things and recognize if that growth is going to occur, how do we do it in different ways? And I think your point is very well taken. It's hard to feel like we can answer a lot of these questions tonight. I think what it is having an awareness of it. Lisa gave me a lot of stuff to write down that says, hey, we're doing this stuff. I think some of the stuff with the long-term goals is just that, making sure we're planning for it. What we know will be implemented, that's really what should come out of this whole process with the community participation. Because when you go back to that scope of work, every one of those things has a lot of public outreach and discussion and talk about that. And, you know, what's going to be difficult is making sure when we hear that input, we think about with people talking about today and they're giving input, but they're also speaking for 10, 15, 20, 30 years down the road. So that's part of what the town's going to have to be able to do is sort that out and know this is what it means to commit and lead on this issue.
Okay, well, I appreciate that, that clarification. One thing I did want to throw out there under the category of what's our important for our community to address in the long term. This is, again, the question of whether we're talking short, medium, or long, but it certainly would fall at least under the long term, is to be considering, and this actually is one that falls under both greenhouse gas emission reduction and resilience. And that's the an assessment and a plan for conserving as much conserving forested open land. You can do all of the energy reduction exercises and activities you want, and you should, but we're not talking about anything that actually pulls greenhouse gas out of the atmosphere and sequesters it, other than trees. And so whenever we convert forested land into non-forested land, then we're not only are we releasing carbon back into the atmosphere, but we're also reducing our the ability of the surface area of Kennebunk to absorb greenhouse gas. So our forested land is one of our greatest assets in terms of greenhouse gas reduction. And it also provides an element of resilience to increased heat because it minimizes the extent to which we have trees and to a lesser extent other open forms of open land that reduces the heat island effect that you get when you have large concentrations of pavement, which is only going to become significantly worse. We've already seen that happening in urban areas. So minimizing the extent to which we become urbanized and maximizing the extent to which we have forested land within our borders would certainly be should be a top priority for mitigating the effects of climate change. And then one other thing I wanted to throw out there, I agreed with everything that everybody said, and Lisa, you mentioned a number of different initiatives. Totally concur with the value of all of those. Those aren't necessarily all climate initiatives though, right? So I think it's also important to be thinking about when we're talking about sending this to the state, that we want to be talking about focusing on climate objectives, is my understanding. Things like the plastic bag ordinance that we put into place a number of years ago, and that was also a student-led initiative, I think was great, and I'm very proud that we did that as a community. I totally would support a straw reduction as well, or something along those lines, but I don't necessarily know that it falls under climate objectives. So I think be thinking about how to prioritize those, I guess, and for this particular exercise.
Thank you, Shiloh. Sally, and then I will finish up and we'll get to the public. All right, Sally?
Yeah, one real quick thing. If we're dealing with the community at large, Wells, Biddeford, it'd be really good to have really effective mass transportation, maybe in electric vehicles, and make it something that really is something that the community can use. You know, I know we have some, I'm not sure how well it's utilized, but if there's a way to increase that and make it more useful for people, that could be good thing. Get more cars off the road and reduce fuel.
Thank you, Sally, Lisa, and I'll finish up.
Yeah, sorry, Blake. I just wanted to speak to Shiloh's point about the straws. I think that anytime we can reduce plastic benefits the environment. And then also having lived on the West Coast and seeing the amount of just garbage that comes up onto the coast. I know people say it's to save the turtles, but I think that in general, it's a good idea to just reduce any kind of garbage that we can. But that's all I wanted to say. Go ahead, Blake.
Yeah, no, I agree, totally agree with you.
Thank you. Thank you, Lisa and Shiloh. When I was much younger, I was a bartender, and I always knew it was time to cut somebody off when they started trying to suck the drink through their swizzle stick. So plastic should have been gotten rid of a long, long time ago. I'm also, it's interesting to think about Bill's bringing up that the state is going to shoot for 2100. I was just trying to think about how old I'll be when that happens. And I think that works out to 149 years old. So the point is that a journey of 1,000 miles starts with the ground beneath one's feet, which has now been restated as a journey of 1,000 miles starts with a single step. And the good news for us, when I look at things that the community has done well, is that we have taken several steps already. And for that, we have the Energy Efficiency Committee to thank. They have been keeping this top of mind for many years, and especially now with Tony, Maggie, Scott, and Wayne. We have some open positions, right, Lisa? Yep, so we need some more people to
Yes, please.
jump in and start pulling on the oars. But I also think of Nick and of course Sharon, who, God rest her soul, was always keeping this issue top of mind. And that's important because I don't think that this community is populated by a bunch of Luddites who deny climate change. I think we already have come to the conclusion that that's a real thing. And so we have that advantage. The thing that I would focus on, and again, this is just initial spitballing here, but it seems to me that we should work. We're always looking for opportunities to work with the RSU. It seems to me that this would be a perfect type of thing to partner with the school district to see if we could make this part of their curriculum, engage the classes or the students in the process, which would not only help us in terms of climate planning and climate change action plan, but more importantly would help them understand how the town works and what civics are all about. So, we're always looking for ways to engage the school. This might be a perfect opportunity for us to leverage youth, people who actually might be around in 2100, and get them to help us with this project. So those are just the two things off the top of my head, as well as the swizzle stick anecdote. All right, moving on to the public. Let's hear what the public has to say. And Betsy, who's long been an advocate of the climate, is with us. John has his hand up, so welcome to the meeting, John.
All right. This has been a really interesting discussion. I appreciate everyone's thoughts. I actually don't have any specific answers to these questions, but I'd like to offer a few thoughts. Many of the choices that we would make in pursuing such an agenda will be obvious win-wins. We've all experienced that. When you insulate your home, you save money and you benefit the environment. But there will also be a lot that are trade-offs. And I think that we need to go into such an initiative with some consideration of that fact. I'm going to cite a couple of examples that have been brought up, and I certainly don't mean to call out or call attention to the folks who brought them up. I don't even remember who brought them up. But just as examples, one person talked about electric school buses at the RSU. It's a wonderful idea. It's great for the environment. It will reduce fuel costs. But these are just coming onto the market, and the upfront capital costs are going to be extraordinary. So if we're talking about converting to an electric school bus fleet, then you can't howl about the school budget, because you're talking about an incredible, stupendous capital investment in such technology. Someone else mentioned requiring LEED type building standards for new construction. LEED is something that I know a lot about because I deal with it professionally. Typically, LEED projects run double or more the cost of non-LEED projects. So if you're going to make LEED requirements, then you're really going to be excluding lower cost housing development and more accessible housing. Not that these goals are bad, not that those things shouldn't be pursued, but I think we need to go in with our eyes open. The trade-offs will be necessary. And I would suggest that rather than pursuing things that sound good or appear good as they come up on the screen, we recognize that the ability as a municipality to affect climate change is real but limited. That when we look at an agenda for doing so, that we try as much as possible before acting to gather information about all the possible ways that we might advance this goal and look at the trade-offs, decide some bang for the buck type things, and perhaps there will be things that come across our plate that we say we don't care how much it costs, it's worth doing. But that as much as possible, we try to refrain from investing resources into things that appear to be a good idea without having worked out the full costs and jumping wholeheartedly into that trade-off, accepting that trade-off, committing the resources to the trade-off. Because the fact is that our town has limited resources. We are hearing that our staff has limited time and that that's influencing decisions that we're making on a policy level. We have limited financial resources. So not to say that any of these things are bad ideas, they're good ideas, but we need to be cognizant of that fact. And lastly, I'll close it off. When we make a commitment to pursuing these strategies, I think we need to really commit to it. That is something that unfortunately I feel like has not always been done. The example I would cite is that we wrote into CPRC's contract that they were required to do curbside collection of compost. And we did that for environmental reasons. And when they came in and said, yeah, we're not doing that anymore, the select board said, okay. So like, if that's the level of commitment to these environmental initiatives, then we probably shouldn't undertake them. So,
John, thank you. Moving on to Ted Trainer.
Can you hear me?
Yeah,
I
hi
have
Ted,
a-
welcome to the meeting.
Thank you. A general comment. I really commend Chris for bringing this, joining up with the governor's initiative, and I commend the debate that you folks have just been having for the being part of the comprehensive plan committee. We've worked on climate change issues and trying to develop the interest of that in the town. We worked very hard at it. And so I think it's very gratifying for me to hear the discussion tonight, and I thank you for it.
Thank you, Ted. Thanks for those kind words. I'm guessing Maggie, but it could be Nick.
It's Maggie.
Hi, Maggie, welcome.
Hi, thank you, Blake. Maggie Bartenhagen, member of the Energy Efficiency Committee. And I wanted to acknowledge and appreciate Blake's comments about the efforts that the Energy Efficiency Committee has made to moving this discussion forward in the way that we have now seen it happening here. And in particular, Sharon Stas, who we lost last summer, as we all know, who was chair of the committee and really had worked on these issues for years. So I think she would be delighted at this level of discussion around these issues. I wanted to ask a couple of questions in regards to the cohort, the CAP cohort that Chris has discussed here. And the first question I have is related to the first bullet point on identifying public engagement consultant. And I'm wondering if that person would be the individual that the 4-town cohort would engage to do outreach, education, and community buy-in on this issue. And if that is indeed the case, I'm wondering when this effort begins. My impression is that this cohort, the Climate Action Plan cohort that Southern Maine Planning and ICLEI are working on getting off the ground is obviously going to happen after the town agrees to the scope of work and Chris submits the paperwork. I'm wondering what the time frame is for that. When would this work actually begin? That's my first question.
Chris.
That is a great question. For some reason, my computer doesn't want to open a file that gives me the schedule, but what I can tell you, and let me back up since I don't have that. Let me read something I think is very helpful because it describes what's important. When the cohort put together the scope of work, they had said SMPDC and municipal contacts will work together to develop a scope of work for public engagement consultant, issue an RFP, and select consultants to support the local CAP cohort. And the bullet item they said is the public engagement consultant will support the cohort and the community task forces with public engagement efforts through providing meeting and event facilitation, developing outreach and engagement materials, supporting community survey efforts, supporting community engagement events, etc. The community task forces, and that's the community itself, who our representatives are, will lead the public engagements efforts with the support of the public engagement consultant at SMPDC. So they're sort of trying to take a bird's eye view and saying, here's everything we think we need to do to make this work. But again, our role also with the town is to develop that RFP and prioritize, make sure that all that's captured in there. So I think what we have is where we're trying to put the right people in the right positions to do this. And I do think that consultant is who is going to be very experienced at identifying who they think are the stakeholders and also say to us who we miss. I mean, I think we've heard the RSU mentioned a couple of times in this discussion, and we may not have mentioned them, and they would often say, you know, here's what we've also found. So you're going to get a balanced approach to this. Their purpose will be a lot of those things identified. Us will be to augment and kind of complement that. So that's what their role is going to be. All right, so let's see if the person smarter than me did something that's going to work. Or I can call IT and tell them why my computer locked up. So the timeline we saw from, oh, well, I'm just going to spitball it. If I'm wrong, I'll correct it next week. How's that? Because the timeline is fluid. And I think what it means is we had identified a start program of, I want to say April. And the reason why I want to say April is that's when we knew we were going to develop this RFP and kind of go through this work. The idea that we would try to issue, if funding becomes available, we would award and launch kind of from that July standpoint. All the communities kind of have different resources available to them at different times. But I think what we'd be anticipating is kind of a summer launch where we would be, I don't want to say full steam ahead, but we will have assembled all those things and begin that process where they do the outreach and the inventory. Some of the technical stuff is going to happen in parallel. When you think about the greenhouse gas emissions and inventory and all that stuff, that's kind of by SMPDC and the technical people doing that stuff. But the engagement process has all these targeted points along the way. And you know what? I wish this would open, but I don't know why it won't. I apologize for that. So I I am a little bit unprepared to put that on my screen, even though I keep trying. So yes, actually, you know what I'm gonna do? I'm gonna show my powers and see if I can transfer Karen to share her screen. Because she can put it up, and I think that would be extremely helpful. Nice, how'd you do that? I didn't even give her control. I'm turning my mic off. Okay, so I think first off, since I can't control it, I'll see if Karen can read my mind and make sure that's seen. But I think when you look at what it is, it's kind of spanning this spot where even though we have to go through this whole internal process and click the boxes and get started, just in terms of that, when I talk about April and go through that, you know, when we're identifying the consultant in that May timeframe, we sort of got stuff back, and you have to go through that. The RFP process it's cumbersome. I mean, in essence, we're going to go through, and you kind of have to have these representatives go through all of these things, and they have, you can see from a monthly basis, targeted all of these steps along the way on the regional activities. They're sort of doing all of these things in tandem. And you can see when they say the lead, who those people are, the regional public engagement, that's really going to happen by that consultant. And their process is getting a lot of this stuff planning, and then it steps up in different ways all throughout. And the color coding means a lot of different things. I think we'll probably simplify this a little bit, because what we're going to do is sort of develop its own little internal plan for when we say to the public, just like it's on our calendar, we have these things, but think about when the public can plan ahead and think about all of those types of things to participate and actually have materials available. So I don't do what I did tonight. We're asking the questions, you have to think on the fly. What are we going to do to really enhance that engagement in all those different levels? So that's a strength we expect to see from them, and also the feedback we can get from other processes.
Bill?
Yeah, quick question on that, Chris. Looking at that spreadsheet in front of me. Okay, where, I guess the question is, where do we fit in as a community? I mean, I'm assuming that you're going to be kind of the pivotal, the point person on all this.
Yep.
When you go
So,
to that committee, or you and Mike, or some whoever. And so, as I look down through your list of things, I'm seeing some interesting things. I just don't know where we begin to dovetail in and where these things start to become developed.
yeah, if you look at,
Chris, hang on a sec. Maggie, I'll come back to you. Sorry.
Thank you.
okay. Yeah, I apologize. That's true. I probably started talking and invited more questions than I should have. So to answer Bill's question, if you look at the lower line in the green and all the task force meetings, the task force is really going to be made up of our community members. And those are a lot of the pieces that they're going to be kind of like ambassadors for, either trying to speak for the community or think about what the community's wants and needs are and set up those broader public discussions. That in the green in the bottom is us. And it's not just me, it's a lot of us. Yeah, so all the public meetings and all those different parts to it. So does that help a little bit?
Okay,
Yeah.
Maggie, sorry, we let Bill cut the line there. Back to you, Maggie.
That's perfectly fine, no problem. I guess this has brought up another question, and I guess I would ask who determines who makes up the community task force?
That'll be the select board. Undoubtedly getting broad and important community representation. That's the key. If we're going to have a plan that means something to the community, who is the community? And representing all those people who are affected by it, both directly, indirectly, decision makers, people, and all of that, right? I mean, I can tell you, I learned the most when I have a public meeting and people ask me questions I didn't think of. And that's what makes this work, because we're preparing ourselves to try to educate. And just like Blake said, you think about the students and put it in their curriculum. They're going to carry this forward. So who, the answer simply, the select board, through any types of recommendations. I think certainly I would offer any experience I've had of who's helped me learn things, but everybody who can offer that. We have to be effective, but that's beyond my level to say who should make it up. I know who is effective, but there's probably all kinds of other people that need to be there. So that's something we would control as the town of Kennebunk.
Okay. And just a few other comments. I know that ICLEI, which is, I can never remember the acronym, but it's the we all know who ICLEI is. They are planning a bunch of workshops and learning opportunities. And I would just throw these out. And if the members of the select board would like me to send them a list of these things, I would be happy to do that. But if you, I mean, the town of Kennebunk is a member of the Global Covenant of Mayors and ICLEI, and we are about to renew our membership. So anyone can access this information. And for instance, there will be a workshop, I believe, beginning in March on climate and sustainability communication workshops. That is an opportunity for someone who would facilitate a discussion among several communities on actually how to communicate these issues to people in, to the stakeholders, to people in the community. There is also, there are, hold on a minute, tools on that website, one of which is called ASAP, which is an Atlas of Sustainability Action Plans. And this gives examples of what other communities around the country and presumably in other countries are doing in regards to their climate action plans, what they look like, how they develop them, what problems they may have had. It's really a rich resource for information along the lines of what we're talking about here tonight. There are other tools as well, and if there is interest, I will send them out to you. But I just wanted to pass that along, that we don't, as I think Shiloh mentioned, not necessarily a good idea to just pull up ideas and respond in the immediate present without doing a little research perhaps on what has been done before, what has worked before, what is, examples of things that have worked that other communities have established, and just as a guide or a resource for this community to look at what's been done. So I would just pass that along to you if there's interest.
Thank you, Maggie. I'm sure Chris will be in touch if.
Absolutely. Yep.
Very good.
Any of that input is going to be critical, and certainly welcome it and would appreciate it.
Okay. I don't see any other hands up from the public or the board, and I think we're just about right on time, right, Chris? We're just about.
Yes, I believe
Next steps.
I get to collect my bonus for bringing this in on time. Get a hamburger for dinner.
Actually, it's a bag of peanuts that you get. So
you know me well. Or nuts, actually, but yeah. So probably.
What are the next steps, Chris? I mean, where do we go from here?
This is great. As I mentioned before, at the next meeting, I will be presenting a municipal resolution for us to adopt. It comes right from the sample. I'm going to identify many of these things that were in the cohort, because that's what we want to focus on. That aligns exactly with the state's minimum wage program. If the board adopts that resolution, I will take that, and that will give me enough, coupled with the checklist, to enroll us in the Community Resilience Partnership, and that makes us eligible for SMPDC to apply for the grant funding. Whether we get the grant funding or not, doesn't matter. What we do need is we need the citizens to approve the $59,000 in the budget, because that's really what we know is going to fund it. The grant would offset some of that if we're successful, but if it doesn't, that's really what the key is. So obviously, even though we're going to take those next step, continued outreach and awareness, and I don't want to try to tell people to, cheer on the budget. It's obviously very important in many different ways, but that is contained in it. So if that were to not succeed, and this is important to the board, then I think there would be a funding deficit you'd have to think about how to fill post July 1. So I have enough to work for the next steps right here, but obviously 3, 4, 5, and all the way down the line, keep going. But that's what we need for now. And as I think your action next Tuesday will give me the direction I need. If you choose not to do that, then I know what that means. If you do, thank you in advance.
I guess that brings to a close this section of our meeting. Got a lot of work to do. A journey of 1,000 steps or 1,000 miles starts with a single step. unfortunately, the time frame in which we have to traverse those 1,000 miles has become shorter and shorter. And I'm sure Shiloh will acknowledge that already the 2.5 degree rise in global temperature is not enough to forestall the loss of 1,400 species of animals in the next 10 years or so. Right, Shiloh?
Yeah, it's something along those lines. The exact number is not entirely clear, but yes, that's absolutely true. We're already at the point that we're in a mitigating as much of the damage as we can, as opposed to stopping the effect from happening entirely, because we're 30 years into this and only just now getting rolling. So we've got to play as much catch up as quickly as we can.
Yeah, so we don't have the luxury of flapping our gums too much longer here. I mean, we need to take action. And I think this meeting, thanks to Karen and to Chris and to Mike for putting this together, we'll be taking action, I'm sure, next Tuesday night. Can't promise that, but we certainly, that's my prayerful expectation. So the only other item on our agenda is item 3, discuss the town manager recruitment process. And this is going to be a fairly short conversation. We expect to have in hand by this Friday, proposals from 3 executive recruitment firms to assist us in the task of finding a replacement for Mr. Pardue. And so obviously that's a good first step, but once we've identified those people, then we're going to need to begin to interview those 3 people. And because this falls uniquely within the ambit of the select board's duties, we're going to have to work a lot harder. We're not going to be able to turn to other people like we do with other projects, which is not to say that Jerry, Sheldon, and Mike are not going to be pulling on their oars to help us in that regard. But we're gonna have to do a lot of this on our own, and we need the public's input for sure. But at this moment, we're not really prepared to have much more of a conversation unless somebody has specific questions about how we intend to proceed here. Shiloh.
The proposals from the firms that are coming in, those are simply, they're proposing to us how they would go about this and what it would cost us.
That's correct.
And then we would then at some point return to them essentially a list of criteria, job description, what we're looking for in a town manager, those elements, and that would be the basis for which they would start searching.
I think that's a reasonable expectation, is that the town manager's job description would be the basis for that conversation. Certainly, we can take a look at the town manager job description and see if there are any changes, but that's been updated fairly recently. And but it certainly would be something important to do before we got too deeply into the process. So yeah, I think that's what's going to happen, is we will interview the firms, and then we will make a decision about what firm makes the most sense for us to get involved with.
And the select board as a whole, they'll come before the select board at some point,
Yeah,
and in a
absolutely.
meeting and have that conversation.
Yes. Yeah, I mean, we want to keep this open and honest and in front of the public. And so, but there, obviously we can't convene a meeting every time we have a conversation with one of these groups, but they will all be very preliminary and not really substantive, more procedural than anything else. And then I would envision that we would have them come to a meeting and have a discussion with us about how they view the process and how they could help us in our search. Does that make sense to you, Shiloh?
It does. I had some other thoughts, but I want to see if anybody else has things they want to say beforehand.
Anybody from the board We got John. John's hands up. John, welcome back.
Thanks. And I realized I didn't identify myself properly last time I spoke. John Cuss on Dane Street. So I've heard you talk about search firms, and I believe that the personnel policy talked about advertising of the position. So my presumption is that this town manager search is going to follow the process outlined in the town's personnel policy. Also, I'm glad you brought up the town manager job description, because after our last budget meeting, when the town manager said that the town manager job description had been updated from the many decades old one that I had been given a year or two ago, I asked when that had been approved by the board, and obviously wanted to see a copy, but I didn't get any response. So just want to jog folks' memory.
Mike, I thought you sent that to John.
It did go out. I'll check tomorrow and see if it went out from Jerry to John. John will have one to you tomorrow. I'll make a note.
Okay, thanks. Did not receive. And also when that was approved by the board, because I'd like to listen to the discussion. Thanks.
Thank you, John. Anybody else from the board? Back to you, Shiloh. Did you have some other thoughts?
Well, I guess, maybe if it's not right now, well, Lisa's
Yeah.
got her hand up, but if it's not right now, then at some point we need to talk about the once the candidates come in, what is our procedure? I mean, once we bring on a firm, which I think is a good idea, and they've solicited candidates, but let's say we're lucky and we get a list of good candidates, and the process then that we go through, or how we solicit input on ideas, or whether we're going to solicit input on those potential candidates. And then, I mean, ultimately, it's very clearly this board's decision who we hire as a new town manager, but how we get there is kind of up to us as well. So if we're not doing that now, then I'd be curious as to when we are going to have that discussion.
Shortly. We do need to have the discussion. I mean, you and I talked about it preliminarily, but it's not unlike the SCOTUS process, the Supreme Court nominee right now, which in my experience, having done a number of these executive searches, the process usually involves one-on-one meetings with the board, and then a public meeting with the candidate or candidates. That's the typical way it proceeds. But we all have to put a big TBD on that process until we have agreed upon it. So does that make sense? Yeah.
I guess I thought that tonight was that when we were going to be discussing that, but if it's not, then I'm happy to do it at a future date prior to that process beginning.
Yeah, I'd like to put my head together with yours, and maybe you and I can come up with an outline of how to lead that discussion in a thoughtful way rather than do it on the fly here, and give everybody advance notice so they can have ideas and questions in mind before we go there, if that's okay.
Well, in that case, I would absolutely, yeah. I mean, I think it's always good to have reflection before action. And so, but I would encourage everybody on this board, or anybody listening, but particularly those board members, to be thinking about this and what examples are out there, what your personal thoughts are about how this might go forward. Because it's a big decision to do, and we want to make sure we do it right. So, I don't think this should be to any one of us. And ultimately, we'll have a discussion, and it will be a board decision as to how we proceed. But even laying out the options, I think, is important if people. We're all talking about it right now, so this would be a good time to start thinking about it if you haven't already. So that's all.
And so again, like SCOTUS, there are individual meetings, but then there's a public hearing, and that's what I think we would pursue that model. John, do you have your hand back up there?
Hi, it's actually me.
Oh,
We're
hey.
really hard to have two computers up at the dinner table at the same time. So sorry. Rachel Phipps, 11 Dane Street, Kennebunk. Yeah, just a couple of things. I really do hope that this town manager hiring process has more public input than the last process. The last process was really sort of an assignment by the select board, and there was not even an interview or hiring process. So I do hope that changes this time. And I would suggest, if you're looking for models, actually looking at the process for hiring the RSU 21 superintendent. I was a part of that process, and it was incredibly rigorous. We had 43 people on the hiring committee, including a really equal distribution of staff, students, community members, parents, really all stakeholders very equally represented on the hiring committee. We had multiple steps. We had rubrics that had quantifiable numbers. Like, we quantified every candidate with numbers based on 12 predetermined categories. It was incredibly rigorous, and with broad participation from every stakeholder. And I think it also can, we had an amazing outcome from that. So I would really recommend looking at that process and looking at how you can broaden out that search committee and the process of input and stakeholders being involved in the process. I just think it's a really great model to look at. So thank you.
Thank you, Rachel. I think that's about it. Unless anybody else from the public wishes to be heard. Anyone on the board, thoughts before? So I think what we'll do, Shiloh and I will put our heads together and come up with a game plan for how to have the initial discussion about the process. He and I have already talked about how to engage the public in this. We also will lean on Jerry Sheldon, who does have quite a bit of experience, over 30 years in human resources, as well as Mike, who has participated in a lot of searches. And so we'll continue to make good use of his experience as we go forward. But I just don't want anyone to think that we're letting the grass grow beneath our feet. And I guess that's that. Anyone else, anything that anybody would like to bring up or say, or actually are ending early tonight? That's a miracle. Yes, good, happy, thumbs up. All right, that's good. Lisa's smiling. Sally's got a thumbs up.
One question, Blake, while I'm thinking about it.
Oh, Lisa, yeah.
So once we get the quotes from the firms and we interview them and everything, then will we have another workshop format to discuss next steps, or will that be in a regular meeting?
Well, I think we're going to do both those on parallel tracks, because I don't think we can afford to wait on one before the other. But
Right.
I do think that probably process should be specified first while we find a search firm. But also the search firm is going to inform that process as well. They're the ones that do this on a routine basis. And I know when I've done executive searches in the past, we've always leaned on the advice, the sound advice of the executive search firm, also known as a headhunter, to help us think through it, because they do it routinely, and we do this once in a blue moon.
Great.
So yeah.
Okay.
All right. But we're working on it, and that's the important thing. And this is one that we can't afford to twiddle our thumbs over. So we will be on this. All right. Well, I guess we don't need a motion to oh, there's Bill.
Yep, sorry. I think on this, the one thing I went back and I looked at the email from February 14th that Mike had sent out with the copy of the job description. And I think as when we're ready to go with the search firm, I think we have to take a look at what and maybe between now and the next meeting, what people should do is get a list of ideas based on that email and the job description that's in there about what we are looking for in a town manager. So we have a clearly identifiable list of goals, list of things to go for. in terms of the qualities and quantities we're looking at. Just a
Thank you,
thought.
Bill. Yep. So what Bill's suggesting is everybody do a little head scratching in the interim while we're putting together the process and finding the firms that we can interview. So I think that's good advice. So I think that's it. We're going to land the plane a little on early so everyone can grab a meal or watch TV or do whatever you plan to do. I know Lisa's probably going to study because she's in school right now.
Yes, I've got a big paper due on Friday.
Oh, God. I do not, I don't miss those days. So God
It's
bless
good
you.
for you.
All right, everyone. It's good to see everyone there. It's good for you. Yes, that's right. See ya.